over the years, I wonder, what about in our experiences? Have we told other people to teach, endorsed other teachers? What about that practice of endorsing teachers, and then the second layer of responsibility that goes with that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what your experience is, but
well, I've got a lot of experience in that, because in my 20s, I was asked by my teacher at the time, Rabbi Joseph Gilberman, to start an interfaith seminary, which I did, and it's ridiculous, but I started that when I was 26 years old, the year after I myself was ordained. And I had no idea really what I was getting into at the time, and it became a very it took fire rapidly, and is now a 21-year-old organization, a non-profit based in London, and it's trained and ordained over 600 ministers. And so I myself trained and ordained hundreds of people. And one of the things that I've had to really grapple with and forgive myself for is that I did train and ordain some people and endorse them to teach that, if I were doing that today, I would hesitate to. And now it's just because I have so much more experience and so much more understanding of what can go wrong, and how much maturity and integration it really takes to be able to hold that role in a way that's safe and appropriate.
What would you do differently now then?
Well, I'd probably make the training like a lot longer than it actually was. And I would make the requirements for ordination much stricter in terms of, and it would be a case-by-case situation, which is really how I'm doing it now. Many people ask to study, in my methodology and to be able to share my teachings, and I'm hesitant to actually say yes to that. But instead, I'm open to mentoring individuals, but I'm very clear with them. There's no fixed endpoint. I can't tell you that in 2 or 3 years, after this number of, days of studying or what have you, that I'm going to be happy to endorse you and give you the rubber stamp, because there's no set time frame where somebody is ready. I think it's a very unique thing, and it's an interaction between a true calling, what their natural talents and gifts are, how much inner work they have done, how much of their own suffering and confusion and shadow they have been able to integrate, and the development of certain attitudes and insights and understandings, and what I call the settledness of soul. Like you can feel it when someone's presence is substantial and deep and embodied, and that's a subtle thing. You can't just say this, and this equals, somebody who would fit that category. And this is where I think in, more classical traditions, ordination or the authority to teach has sort of been given by others in that lineage. And so there's good reason for that.
Yeah. And it's something we're questioning now, and I'm delighted we're questioning it. Does it work at all? Okay, is it making courses deeper? And at the same time, when you're saying you can sense from somebody that there's a depth, it reminds me of not all who have Shakti, who have deep transmission is a slightly different thing, but I want to segue into it. It's not everybody who has a lot of Shakti is operating with integrity at all. And so different parts can be much more advanced than other parts.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for us all to understand. And I think that's what's created some really sort of difficult experiences for so many people, because we've seen, so many beings with a thunderous depth of presence and realization and Shakti and great gifts to help people open to deeper states of consciousness, and yet other parts of them seemingly not touched at all. And again, I think in part this sort of pleads an important case for the importance of psychological integration in tandem, and particularly for Westerners, because this is a much more complicated culture. And I don't think it works very well to take a particular teaching from one culture like India or China, or Tibet, and just transplant it in a culture where the values and the whole meme is so completely different, and the temptations are so much greater because this is a very permissive society and everything's available, and
yes,
and the relationships between men and women and sexuality are very different here than the way that they're contained in Eastern culture. And so there's so much more room for difficulties and confusion. And I think, what I've come to is that we really need to foster important peer relationships and relationships with people who we are open to receive feedback from, and where we can help one another look honestly and compassionately at places where our integration of our realization might not quite be as deep as it needs to be.
Yes, yes.
And to look at that without judgment or shame. It's no shame in that. I think it's really beautiful. I've had to say to, my former students in England, I had to ask for their forgiveness on, things that were basically, ways that they were in on the receiving end of my personality, just because there were certain things that I hadn't quite had enough support or enough time to integrate fully. And, just in the same way that children deal with the consequences of whatever their parents haven't been able to integrate, so do our students, receive the consequences of what we haven't been able to integrate as teachers. And we need to talk about that honestly, with compassion, and not then have it trash the truth and the beauty that we are sharing. It is true, but to learn more about the nuances of what we are as pure being and as human being in the process of all of this.
Yes. And then so many of our students have trauma in their bodies or unexplored traumatic experiences, because so many are drawn to spirituality to escape suffering.
Yeah.
Often caused by trauma. And
I see that too.
It's so easy for a teacher to re-traumatize. It is so easy because that openness, that vulnerability is there, and we're not therapists. And if we don't have the awareness and the tools, if we haven't unpacked our own trauma, at least as a minimum, we've no way to figure that out. We can't know everything about everything. And it's like, what we don't know about, let's stay away from.
Let's just recognize, or let's just be able to say, it sounds like it would be really great for you to go and, do some specific work with the therapist on this particular piece, because I notice it comes up for you rather a lot, and there seems to be a lot of suffering there. And I think it's an important thing to be able to say from the teacher's chair that there is a real place for therapy and working through issues of the personality. And some spiritual teachers are therapists as well, so they can combine some of both. But, I know a lot of such people who are spiritual teachers and therapists, and they themselves would say there is a real difference between, spiritually oriented psychotherapy and actual spiritual work.
Yes.
Right? And so where there's active trauma, that is the domain of specific trauma therapy. And that's a really important thing for us to be able to say to our students, to recommend that they go get some help in that way, rather than, feed a kind of a common presumption that spiritual work will take care of everything. And I don't think that's true.
It's not true. But when we have a teacher who hasn't done that work on themselves, the willingness to allow for that space, for that possibility to be the experience of a student, that's real and alive. So re-traumatization is what happens because the discernment isn't there to be able to know what's needing therapy and what can spirituality address.
Right.
Lack of clarity is it's fine to, of course, to recommend if the teacher can recognize this isn't spirituality, this is trauma based. But if the teacher hasn't done their own work, and if they're not willing to really address, I'm an ongoing piece of work myself. If they're not willing to address, then that something is going to be closed over. and they won't have the objectivity to even see what's going on with the student. I see that quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, it's ignorance, isn't it? What we don't know about, we can't help with. And yet, unfortunately, people are looking to us for help and presuming that we do know all about this. And so I think this comes back to, what you're doing with the association and possibility maybe of, offering some annual kind of workshops or things that help to sort of walk through such issues and educate, fill in some of the gaps in the broader community.
We're changing the culture, really. I think that's what's needed in order to make the next wave of teachers more informed, more integrated, less on a pedestal within their own minds and therefore projecting it out, with a willingness to work on their own humanity as an ever-evolving process, so that teachers can learn from each other, can learn from having regular friends, will be interested in finding out about new things and exploring what it means for them to be human, will be responsible adults about in terms of responding to their own needs as human beings.
And I think about boundaries. You mentioned something earlier about, so often spiritual teachers, can muddy, friendship and their students. And I think, there are certain people who, have a dual relationship with, but I actually find that term really useful because it helps me kind of keep conscious. Oh, there is a dual relationship. I am someone's teacher and we also have a friendship. And so it's something that from my end, I have to be very attentive to, where is that sort of fudging the line, or where is this not so good for them? Because when you are in the role of the spiritual teacher, I think what we have to really be real about is that it is a position of authority. Even if you're not doing the guru trip, it still is. People are still coming to you with their vulnerability. You're still holding space for them. You're still helping to guide their soul in some way, even though that will vary greatly in the way that that's done. And I think we need to be honest about, about that power differential that actually is there. If you're taking the teacher's seat, it is there.
Oh, it has to be there. And it has to be honored.
And actually it's important, because we need to be able to lean into others that might be further along in their awakening and their understanding and their application, their embodiment than we are. We all need that. It's useful. But how to hold it in a way that doesn't become a power trip, or that doesn't just fall into the guru model that feeds misunderstanding that because this person, is a great teacher, that means that they're infallible, or that means that everything they do must be right. And I think that's in a way the change in the culture that I do my best to embody, that, my role as a teacher is really to help connect my students to the inner guru. That's my role. I help that get as established and as firm and as deep as it possibly can be, so that we end up as, beings who are practicing truth together.
Yes.
That's where I see it's supposed to go, and that, my work and the way I am with them and what I model is toward that end,
Yeah. And I think as we have healthier relationships with the power differential, we're more transparent around what that is and how it functions for us as individuals, the more we can honor and respect and give power to the student. And what does student power look like?
Yeah.
Because they're disempowered. I see that so much. It's like, well, what do you think? What's your opinion? Do you agree with this or do you not? And they're like, I've never been asked that before at a spiritual meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think this is part of the feminine, though, that's rising. It's interesting. We're two women, and just because we're in a female body, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the feminine. But so when I say the feminine, what I mean is, something that has more circular focus to it, that can still include leadership, but at the same time, pauses to just allow space for all of the voices to be heard, and to gather together the best ideas. You know, for example, my community, my Marin Living Grace Sangha, you know, we have 2 meetings a year where there's no agenda other than just getting together and sharing our thoughts and hearing feedback and visioning, you know, into our Sangha and how it's going, and gathering together everyone's best ideas and just hearing what they are with no agenda other than just hearing it and putting everything out on the table and listening to what might be true as the next level of evolution of our actual community. And to me, that's something that I learned to do early on when I was running the seminary in England. Was that every now and again that's needed. Doesn't mean you're going to implement everything that everybody suggests, but to allow space to hear it, for allow space for it to be valued and to be received, is helpful to everybody, you know. And we can include and integrate that and not always just go with the top-down model, because that's the way spiritual teachings have been done, always.
That's right. And as spiritual leaders, what's the feeling when you're looking for feedback openly?
Yeah.
Are you genuinely receiving it? Or is there a judgment? Is there resistance? Are you just going through the motions because it's the latest thing to do? Or is it like authentic? I need other viewpoints here. I need to know how this sounds to you guys in order to integrate and learn as we go and be better human beings. Just how can we be better human beings? It comes down to that.
It does. I mean, my terminology is, you know, more graceful.
Yeah.
You know, deeper, wiser, clearer, more graceful. You know, in the way that we go about everything that we do.
Yeah.
From buying our food at the supermarket to doing our taxes, you know, to responding to those emails, you know, and, you know, I get a lot of questions that come in every day through the internet, and people in a lot of suffering are really needing help, and sometimes in pretty extreme situations, as well as people who are actively my students and working with my teachings and practices. And it's a big task. It is a big responsibility. And, you know, we need support. We need to support one another in, you know, honoring that responsibility and giving our best and keeping it clean. And I think this is a really exciting time, you know.
It is. It's a very exciting time. There's so much potential, so much growth, so much opportunity for education and connection and community. And, you know, I seem to have a kind of repulsion against networking. It's like the antithesis of connecting with each other without the networking agenda.
Right.
That, as I see, is just freeing. And what could we do together? Like, what can we do for the world? Why are we isolated? Why is there so few of us connecting with each other to support each other? You know, and so many teachers, I hear them saying, and I've even hearing them at conferences or speaking at something, they say, well, there's nobody I can talk to. Who can I talk to? And I'm like, that is a belief system. That's just BS. Like, what part of you needs support? Identify the part, identify your needs and the support. You'll find it. You might have to look for it, but you'll find it. Because the enormity is never looking for support. It's the human capacity that's looking for some support.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Right.
And even if it is to explore realizations and deeper insights, of course, no one of us has the deepest understanding of all. We just have different viewpoints of a similar, expansive, infinite spectrum. You know?
Yeah, I do know.
Yeah.
And I think it's a wonderful time. But, you know, again, the popularity of what's called, you know, non-dual teachings, I think there's just so much confusion in that whole terminology, and so much of what I see in the so-called sort of popular non-dual world is pretty half-baked a lot of the time. And what pains me is seeing the confusion that can give rise to. For example, the confusion that if, you know, one has been diagnosed with cancer, that, you know, the dismissal of the body and the negating of, you know, one's sort of animal humanity and the need for compassion and appropriate steps to be taken, you know, to deal with such things. Or, the negating that can happen, from a teacher, who is working only from the absolute level of somebody who's just lost their mother,
Yes.
Using sweeping statements, that isn't real, they were never real, and that can be really, really tricky. And while on the deepest level, most of the deep mystical teachings from all the world's traditions have that level of understanding that, that which changes is not the ultimate reality. However, that ultimate reality sort of manifests in this way, with bodies, with cancer, with mothers dying, with relationships going into difficult places, and the suffering thereof, and the environmental crisis, and so I think sort of an awakened response warrants an openness to the totality of our experience, with openness and compassion and ongoing curiosity to explore, what's true, what's genuine, honest, wise responsiveness to all that life brings.
Yeah, it's the coming into being fully human and fully divine. And it's always a coming into. There's the evolution factor all the time. And I've seen that so often too, with using a non-dual approach, which is actually not going to be conducive to the growth that somebody has come to a spiritual meeting for. And we need to have a larger toolkit. We do really to be able to discern, does this need a dual answer for it to be integrated so that the person can move beyond it? Or do I give a non-dual answer? And what is the risk then of it being pushed out of their awareness, a process that can only be learned from, and a growth opportunity, no matter how painful for the student? But if
I think it's too easy to say dual and then non-dual answer, because my understanding is at the deepest level there is nothing but the one, and so that includes what we think of as the dual answers ultimately, is everything is an arising of the one fabric of being, even those moments where we're angry at our mother, or we're disappointed in our marriage, or we've had a bump with our children, or we're dealing with some health crisis that is happening in the relative scheme of things.
Yes.
And so,
but a teacher can't see that,
right,
until they've done that work themselves, until they've integrated. And there's all these, I suppose, indicators of bad practice, which might have been endorsed traditionally. And as we bring this into a householder's regular life, with all the demands that come thereof, all the levels that have to be go through, by the time the humanity is integrated, it's like they're not compartmentalized. It's not the non-dual is the only reality. It's like, yeah, it's capital R reality, but the other reality, actually, let's not deny that. There's a time when one spiritual teaching is literally about going into the pain and honoring the pain.
Well, everything that I'm teaching is about going towards what is.
Yeah.
Whether what is a wave of anger, or what is an exquisite state of bliss.
Yes.
And everything in between. And it's because my understanding of what non-duality really is that everything is an arising of the one fabric of being. So if you meet it honestly, openly, with sincerity, to be taught something new from your own direct experience, then more of God will reveal itself. That's just, there's a natural purification that happens, and it's not this or that. It's really a sort of a descending and an opening and a deepening, and everything becoming purer and more dimensional. That's my experience, and that's really what I'm teaching. And so I would hope that what I'm actually sharing with people in terms of how to practice is by definition integrative and practical and helpful with whatever it is that they're encountering. And the natural appropriateness of kindness when we're dealing with things that just are objectively difficult.
And I think our culture isn't there yet. When I look at the contemporary spiritual culture, it's not there. And I think there are steps of education, information, sharing, learning, growing that need to happen in order for it to be an integrated approach.
Yeah.
I don't think we're there. And I think the model, even though, you know, I was giving a retreat last week in Fintor in Scotland, and one day we spent completely talking about trauma. And the next day there was like, well, I didn't come here to talk about this. I didn't come here to talk about this. And I'm like, yes, this is the point. This is the point. You see spirituality and you see your life. And they're two separate things. They're a continuum, and one informs the other. And there's the fluid divinity in your humanity. And they looked at me. I've never, ever seen it like that before. But we're delighted to actually see it. And it just happened last week. Exactly that point. It's like it's not in the culture. It's not. And so avoidance is a
Well, I think it comes back to what you were saying, is that a lot of people get into spiritual work because, you know, of course, and particularly sort of non-dual approaches, you know, it's very, very tempting to the ego because it promises, hey, direct path, shortcut. Ego loves a shortcut. I don't think there actually is a shortcut. There is no substitute for rolling your sleeves up and looking at everything inside. The good, the bad, the ugly, the muck and the mess, the hurt, the heartbreak, the anger, the rage, the insecurity, all those things that you so wish weren't there. Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's no real awakening without the willingness to go towards all of that and learn to stay present and undefended, feel everything, face everything, do nothing. That's really what, in my view, it all comes down to. And that is not sexy. That's not exciting to the ego because that seems too much like therapy, you know, and so people very easily dismiss it. Oh, that's not pure Advaita, or that's not. Well, you know, would Ramana Maharshi have needed to have done that? Who knows? But if you actually explore an awakening like his, what I find really interesting about it is that the crucible of his awakening happened through something as ordinary and human as a wave of intense fear. Well, what could be more human than getting triggered emotionally into a state of fear when you look at what were the backdrop to that? Well, his father had died a couple of years ago. Well, I don't care what culture you come from. Your parent dying when you're a youngster is going to be a huge experience in your life. And it's naturally going to set you thinking about death, about who dies. That's just what such huge things in any human life does for us. But it's not told that way. It's, you know, it's just told in some glamorized way. It was, oh, he just lay on the floor and held his breath and all of a sudden he's awake and that's it. Yeah. You know, and there's no mention of the fact that he's up in a cave meditating for 15 years. You know, well, like that's because that's not glamorous either. The actual work it takes to get more stabilized in your realization, the dedication that is required for that to happen for any person, even if you are a great soul. And I think it's our responsibility as spiritual teachers to be more honest about what our journey is like and to be cautious about declaring ourselves as there and to model, you know, the fact that we're, you know, we might have deep realization, and if that's true, that will be apparent to others, our peers and to our students. And, you know, at the same time, to not aggrandize or misuse that, to also model that we're constantly evolving and learning and willing to learn. And I think that would be a great service to everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
Not separate, you know, ongoing process with deep spiritual realization. They're one and the same.
They're one and the same. And it's just embracing the evolution that you started off by speaking about nature. You know, she's not going anywhere. She's just doing the seasons, and the growth, death, birth cycle just continues. And our humanity and our even realizations, how they continue to deepen, are all subject to that same flux. and embracing that within a perspective that is outside of that same loop.
Mm-hmm.
That's the maturity, being able to embody both perspectives at the same time, and the free flow of how one informs the other.
Yeah.
You know, but there's a piece of work to be done in our culture, I think, you know, to move.
I think a lot of work to be done in our culture in just sort of breaking apart some of the myths about there being a shortcut.
Yes.
And
we like to have a goal. We like to idealize. We like to project. We want
to just, give me a shortcut so I don't have to sort of look at anything painful. Well, sorry, I'm not going to get very far. Or you might be able to get into these wonderful states in meditation, but then as soon as you get into a relationship, all your hurt and your anger and your upset's going to come pouring out of you sideways. Well, that's what happens to everybody.
Yeah.
And so as we come down from the mountain, that's really where the humility and the dedication and the devotion to stay true to the revelations that have come alive to us, but to really be dedicated to explore what does it take to really live them, and what's in the way of me living them, moment to moment.
That's right. Yeah. Let's see where it goes, huh? Let's see
where it goes. But I'm really glad to be having this conversation with you, and I look forward to having many more conversations like this with others who are interested as well. And let's see what we can keep learning from one another, and
that's right.
What our students can teach us.
That's right. That's right. There's one little tidbit that was very useful for me on my path that I'm reminded of from the last topic that you brought up, Miranda. And it started in my 20s, that every time I would see a blind spot, or I go, oh, I feel like I've been whatever, hurt or energetically in some way dismissed, or some issue would snap the ego into activity. Mm-hmm. And I came to realize pretty young in my own therapeutic process that the disappointment that I feel because there's more crap up for healing is actually worse than the crap itself. And what I did was I shifted my attitude.
Yes.
And that has stayed with me, and it has been an absolute gem. That even though, yes, there is no attainment, the show is over, it's a done deal. However, the attitude that we have towards the ongoing learning and the ongoing growth can be one that's positive.
I agree, and I'm so glad that you're mentioning that. And I think it's really the dimension of relaxing the superego, right? Because it's really the outer layer of the ego structure that's always judging and commentating how you're going, and it can easily kind of get spiritual and go, oh yeah, if you're really on the spiritual path, you shouldn't feel insecure, get angry, or lose your temper, or be anything less than perfectly patient with everybody. And of course, there are moments where you're not that. You don't live up to those ideals. Yeah. And it makes it mean you're failing or you're bad or what have you. And I think it's really important to be able to understand that and to just smile at that and recontextualize catching ourselves in the act as a constructive and a beautiful part of spiritual practice.
I love it.
Catch yourself in the act. There's a choice. Do I want to act that out? And if with that consciousness, we know that to act it out is suffering for everyone, not just yourself. Or, what can I learn here? What's the way forward? What's the truth? What's a deeper truth in this situation? What's right response? What's skillful?
Yeah, what I've always done is I've actively celebrated it. That was the attitude that I adopted. And I go, yes, a piece of crap that I can shift, and I'm going to feel so much freer when it's done. And that positivity, it's like a catalyst, because I'm motivated around, oh, what's this blind spot? I welcome the blind spot. I'm celebrating the blind spot authentically. Because
you can celebrate the fact that you can see it.
Yeah.
Because if you can see it, there's a choice.
There we go.
And there wasn't a choice before. If you can't see it, you're just going to act it out.
That's right, because you can't see what you can't see. And when it comes up, it's like, happy days, be thrilled that there's something you can see. Be thrilled because you're nearly at the other side, feeling more vastness, more expansion, more whatever level you're at. But it's more of the good stuff,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree completely. Beautiful. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I think
Yeah.
we're kind of there for today, huh?
Yes, it feels like we've come full circle on something, on a bit of fun, to
Yeah.
hanging out.
Yeah, and I look forward to just more. And I think it would be really juicy to sort of talk, and maybe another time, about, what this sort of feminine approach, to spiritual teaching has to contribute, and some of the insights that come from a sort of more feminine perspective would be a really good conversation for us to have at some time.
Let's chalk it in.
Yeah,
I'm there.
good. All right, my dear. Well, thank you, and
Thank you too.
yeah,
Thank you too. And let's catch you all downriver.
yeah, great.